Tennessee, 1854. The fields stretched out in endless rows of cotton, broken only by the crooked fences and the chimneys of houses that smoked like watchtowers. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and the iron tang of chains. It was the South in its cruelest season, a time when men were measured not by their souls, but by the weight of their labor, the steadiness of their backs, the silence of their tongues. And in this silence lived Nathaniel. Nathaniel was a carpenter by trade, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose calloused hands spoke the language of wood. Born to bondage, he had been trained to cut, sand, and shape timber from the time he could walk. His overseers prized his skill, for wood was wealth on the plantations: barns, wagons, fences, cabins. A man who could build was useful. A man who could build in silence was invaluable. But Nathaniel was never truly silent. Each hammer strike carried something more than obedience. Each groove, each hidden joint, each nail buried deep in oak and pine whispered defiance. He was no preacher, no speaker of fiery words. His rebellion lived in sawdust and splinters, in secret compartments tucked where no overseer's eyes would ever look. At night, when the fields fell quiet and the overseer's boots stopped echoing, Nathaniel would run his fingers along the walls he built, the floors he finished, the hollow spaces no one else would know, and he would imagine footsteps inside them, hurried, breathless, terrified footsteps, slipping into the night, vanishing into the woods beyond the reach of the lash. It began as small things. A gap under a cabin floor wide enough for a child to squeeze into, a false panel in the wall of a storage shed, a loft that looked ordinary, but beneath its planks held a dark cavity just large enough for a body to curl inside. Nathaniel's craft was more than construction. It was concealment, and concealment was survival. But survival in Tennessee in 1854 was a fragile thing. Whispers carried across the fields like smoke. A boy whipped until he could not walk. A woman locked in the stocks for speaking back. A man hanged from a tree so near the cabins that every family had to see his body before they ate. These sights pressed into Nathaniel's memory like nails into fresh timber. And with each one, the compartments he carved grew deeper, stronger, more cunning. The overseers praised him, blind to his purpose. "Nathaniel builds clean," they said. "His joints don't split. His beams don't crack." They believed him obedient, a craftsman proud of his work. And he nodded, silent as always, though inside him the hammer never ceased striking. But silence could not last forever. Already there were stories. A boy vanished one night from the fields. No trace, no tracks, no explanation. The masters whispered of thieves, of abolitionists, of northern men stealing property. Yet among the enslaved, another story spread, a story that the boy had not run into the woods at all, but into the walls. That Nathaniel's hammer had carved a doorway to freedom. The story grew like ivy, curling through cabins, wrapping around whispers at night. "The carpenter makes spaces," they said. "Spaces that swallow chains." Nathaniel said nothing. He never confirmed, never denied. He simply kept building, kept carving, kept hiding his rebellion inside the grain of wood. But the South in those years was a place where silence itself was dangerous, where rumors weighed as much as evidence, and where men who built too well, too quietly, drew the wrong kind of eyes. In the spring of 1854, those eyes began to turn. The overseer, a man named Crawford, started watching Nathaniel more closely. He lingered when Nathaniel worked, pacing behind him, tapping his boot on the wood as if listening for hollowness. He asked questions that seemed harmless but carried the edge of suspicion. Why so much timber for that loft, boy? Why's the wall thicker than it needs to be? Why you working nights when no one told you to? And though Nathaniel kept his head bowed, though his voice stayed low, he felt the walls closing around him. The compartments he built were no longer just for the runaways. They became for him as well. Each panel, each hidden cavity a prayer for the day when he, too, might need to vanish. The year pressed on. Summer's heat swelled, cotton bloomed, whips cracked. Men collapsed in the fields. Women staggered under loads too heavy. The air reeked of suffering, yet beneath it ran another current, a quiet defiance, a pulse of something building, and in the heart of that current stood Nathaniel. The carpenter whose silence was more dangerous than any shout. For what began as hidden compartments would not remain hidden forever. What began as silence would end in screams. The winter had passed hard. Frost clung to the cabins long into March, and many did not survive the cold. Children wasted thin on the meager rations of cornmeal and pork fat. Old men froze in their sleep, their bodies carried out at dawn with no ceremony. Death was not rare here. It was expected, the natural consequence of labor wrung past the point of breaking. And yet, amid the hunger and the cold, something else took root, something stronger than despair. The whispers grew. The boy who had vanished the year before was not the last. A woman disappeared next, gone one night after the overseer had struck her bloody for stumbling in the fields. She was there at dusk, her face swollen and eyes glassy. By morning, her pallet was empty, her chains discarded like shed skin. No hounds picked up her trail. No riders caught sight of her on the roads. It was as if she had dissolved into the night itself. The slaves spoke of it in hushed tones, crouched by dying fires. "She found the hollow place," they said. "The carpenter's work swallowed her whole." Nathaniel never answered, but he listened. His silence was its own kind of sermon. By day he built openly, the overseers nodding with approval at his steady hands. By night he refined his secrets. Each board he placed carried the possibility of escape. Each panel he joined concealed a deeper purpose. The floors of cabins rose slightly higher, the walls of barns thickened subtly. The lofts, the storehouses, even the wagons. Nathaniel found ways to carve emptiness into fullness. Hiding places grew like roots beneath the plantation, and with them, so too did suspicion. Crawford, the overseer, was not a clever man, but cruelty often sharpened instincts. He knew something was wrong. Too many gone, too few explanations. The woods could not have swallowed them all. One night, Crawford strode into the carpenter's quarters without warning. He lifted the lantern high, its yellow light cutting across rough planks and curling shavings of wood. Nathaniel was bent over a beam, sweat glistening across his dark back, though the night was cool. "Boy," Crawford said, his voice slurred with whiskey, "what keeps you working after dark?" Nathaniel did not lift his eyes. "The loft ain't finished. Thought to have it ready by morning." Crawford let the silence hang. His boots scuffed the floor. His hand rapped the wood, slow, deliberate. Hollow sounds echoed back. "Strange," Crawford muttered. "Sounds empty." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. The hammer in his hand felt heavier than iron, yet he forced it still. He did not breathe until Crawford finally spat tobacco into the dirt and walked out. But Nathaniel knew. Suspicion was no longer a shadow. It was a flame, and it was catching. The months that followed grew dangerous. Patrols doubled. Dogs were set loose more often, their howls rolling through the fields like a death knell. Whippings became daily ritual. The masters feared rebellion more than they feared the North, and so they bled fear into flesh to keep order. Yet fear, like wood under pressure, does not always split. Sometimes it hardens. Nathaniel worked faster, his hands carving not just compartments, but pathways, roots hidden through timber, exits concealed behind panels that seemed immovable. He tested them himself, crouching in the suffocating dark, counting how many breaths before panic rose, how much time before the air grew thin. He lined some with scraps of cloth to muffle sound, others with loose earth that could be pushed aside from within. These were not mere compartments anymore. They were tombs turned into doorways, word spread further than Nathaniel ever intended. Runaways from other plantations began to arrive, guided by rumor, by the map of whispers passed from cabin to cabin. They sought the carpenter, the man who made walls into passageways, the man who hammered freedom into wood. And though Nathaniel never welcomed them openly, his silence became permission. His hands kept working, and the spaces kept growing, but the South was listening too. By late 1855, the masters spoke of uprisings in hushed voices. Nat Turner's rebellion was still a scar, and the air crackled with the fear that another storm might rise. Every disappearance became evidence of conspiracy. Every hollow sound in the walls became an omen. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a fire broke out in the fields. Whether by accident or by torch, no one knew. Flames devoured rows of cotton and smoke blotted the stars. Panic tore through the plantation, overseers shouting. Slaves forced to form lines and beat the fire back with buckets of water. In the chaos, another family disappeared. By dawn, the fire was out, the fields scarred black. The overseers furious, Crawford rode through the cabins, his whip striking indiscriminately. "Somebody's helping them," he bellowed. "Somebody's hiding them under our noses." The whip cracked, again and again, until the ground was slick with blood. Nathaniel endured it all, head bowed, his silence deeper than screams. But as the lash tore across his back, he repeated one truth inside his mind. Wood does not betray. Wood remembers its maker. Wood keeps its secrets, yet even secrets cannot remain buried forever. The whispers had become too loud, the carpenter's name too dangerous. Even those who had never seen his compartment spoke of him. Mothers hushed their children with tales of the man who carved doors into walls. Overseers cursed him by name, though they had no proof. Nathaniel had built a legend as much as he had built compartments. And legends are flames. They spread, they consume, and sooner or later someone tries to stamp them out. The stage was set. Suspicion had turned into certainty, and the carpenter's silence would soon be broken, for what began as whispers was about to erupt in fire and blood. This year began with a heaviness that clung to the air like smoke. Every disappearance left the plantation more restless, every rumor more poisonous. The masters could no longer dismiss it as chance. Someone was working against them. Someone was carving escape routes in the very bones of their property. The overseer Crawford sharpened his cruelty into a blade. Chains were tightened. Searches became routine. He ordered the cabins torn apart plank by plank, prying up floors, striking walls with the butt of his rifle. Yet no proof appeared. The compartments were too subtle, the craft too perfect. Still, Crawford's eyes always returned to one man, Nathaniel, the carpenter. The silent one, he was too skilled, too careful, too steady. Crawford hated him for his quiet, for the way he absorbed punishment without breaking, for the way his hammer seemed to echo like a heartbeat through the fields. One day, Crawford decided to test him. A young boy, no older than 12, was caught with scraps of dried meat hidden in his shirt. He claimed he had stolen it for himself, but Crawford accused him of feeding runaways, of working with the carpenter. The boy denied it, his voice trembling. Crawford dragged him before the quarters, tied him to a post, and called Nathaniel forward. "Build me a box," Crawford ordered, tossing down rough boards. Small, tight, fit for a rat. Nathaniel's heart froze, but his hands did not falter. Under Crawford's gaze, he cut the wood. Each strike of the saw was a betrayal. Each hammer blow a sentence. The box rose from the ground, crude, narrow, a coffin in all but name. When it was finished, Crawford shoved the boy inside and nailed the lid shut. The cries echoed through the yard, muffled, desperate. The slaves watched in horror, their faces blank with forced stillness. Nathaniel stood rigid, the hammer still in his hand. He had built compartments to save lives. Now, under the overseer's command, he had built one to crush the breath out of a child. Crawford left the boy in the box for hours, until the cries turned to silence. When at last he opened it, the child's body was limp, his face pale, alive but barely. The overseer laughed, a sound like broken glass. "See what your carpenter builds," he sneered. The boy was dragged away. Nathaniel's hands shook for the first time in years. His craft had been twisted into horror. His silence, once his shield, now felt like complicity. From that day on, Crawford grew more deliberate. He followed Nathaniel to his work sites, tapping the beams, prying at panels, searching for hollowness. He began to set traps, locking slaves inside barns at night, sealing doors, testing if anyone vanished through unseen openings. One night, he found something, a false wall in the storage shed. Subtle but not invisible. Behind it, empty space where food had been concealed, provisions for runaways. Crawford's rage was volcanic. He dragged Nathaniel from his quarters, beating him until blood soaked the dirt. "Thought you were clever, Carpenter?" he spat. "Thought you could outbuild me?" But Nathaniel said nothing. His lips were sealed even as teeth cracked beneath the whip. Silence was his last defense. The overseer locked him in the tool shed, swearing to tear apart every cabin, every barn, until the carpenter's secrets were unearthed, and unearthed they were. Within days, the patrols discovered another compartment, beneath the loft of a wagon large enough to hide 2 people. The evidence was undeniable. The master, a portly man with trembling hands, stared at the hollowed wood as if it were a serpent. "He's been betraying us under our very noses," he whispered. Punishment was certain. Death, slow and public, to make an example of the carpenter. But Nathaniel's work had already spread too far. His compartments were not just wood and nails. They were faith carved into timber. The slaves had seen too many vanish through them, too many survive when survival seemed impossible. And so, on the night before his execution was to be carried out, the plantation was not silent. Whispers moved like fire through dry grass. Men sharpened hidden blades. Women passed scraps of food hand to hand. Children were told to keep close and not to scream. The compartments Nathaniel had built were no longer just hiding places. They were waiting mouths, ready to open. Crawford, drunk on power and whiskey, did not see it. He strutted through the cabins, barking orders, boasting that the carpenter would hang at dawn. He laughed that he would burn the man's hands first, so he could never build again. But Nathaniel, locked in the tool shed, heard another sound beneath Crawford's laughter. A rhythm, a pulse, the quiet preparation of rebellion. That night, while the overseer slept, a woman crept to the shed and slipped a file beneath the door. Nathaniel's hands, bruised and bloodied, closed around it. He worked at the lock in the dark, the scrape of metal on iron steady as a heartbeat. By the time the first rooster crowed, the carpenter was free. The compartments he had carved across the plantation would now serve a different purpose. No longer routes of escape, they would be arsenals, traps, graves. The wood would remember, and when the overseer woke still drunk and gloating, the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. What began as silence was now a tremor, and tremors, when ignored, become earthquakes. The hollow truth had been revealed, and it would not rest quietly again. The night before dawn was heavy, thick with the breath of storms not yet broken. Clouds smothered the moon, and the plantation lay in darkness deeper than any overseer's sleep. Nathaniel moved like a shadow among shadows. Freed from the tool shed, his body bore the whip's marks, but his silence was no longer submission. It was purpose. His hands, once punished for their skill, now shook with something more dangerous than fear, resolve. The compartments he had carved across the land waited for him. Some empty, some filled with faces staring wide-eyed in the dark, their whispers barely audible. "Is it time?" they breathed. Nathaniel did not answer with words. He touched the wood, pressed his calloused palm against the grain, and gave the smallest nod. The wood would speak for him. When the overseer Crawford woke that morning, the plantation was not as it had been. His boots thudded against the porch as he shouted for the slaves to line up. But the yard was still, too still. No children crying, no women stirring the cook pots, no men bent and waiting for orders. The silence unsettled him. He stormed toward the cabins, whip in hand, but the doors stood ajar, shadows moving within. A sudden slam rang out behind him, then another and another, doors closing, bolts sliding. The compartments Nathaniel had built were opening, releasing what they had swallowed. From beneath floorboards, from behind walls, from hidden lofts, men and women emerged. Not running this time, not vanishing into the woods. They carried axes, knives sharpened on stone, even boards torn loose from the walls themselves. Tools had become weapons, Crawford sneered, lifting his whip. So it's rebellion, then? It was his last full sentence. The first blow struck fast, an axe handle cracking across his jaw. He staggered, his whip snapping uselessly in the air. Then they were upon him. Dozens of hands, dozens of years of rage compressed into a single moment. The whip was torn away, his rifle wrenched from him. A knife found his side. A hammer struck his skull. His screams echoed through the yard, but no help came. For the other overseers were already under siege. Nathaniel's compartments had not only hidden people, they had hidden weapons, food stores, and escape routes planned in silence for months. At once, the plantation erupted. Flames licked the fields, barns blazed like torches against the dawn, and smoke rose in thick, choking clouds. The masters awoke to the roar of fire and the cries of men who had once bowed to them. Their great house, with its polished floors and high ceilings, became a trap. The hidden compartments Nathaniel had carved into the servants' quarters now spewed forth an army that had been waiting inside its own walls. The fight was merciless. Overseers were dragged down, their blood soaking into the soil they had forced others to till. Some begged, their voices breaking with promises of mercy. But mercy had long ago been burned away by the lash, by the stocks, by the coffins built for the living. Nathaniel did not shout, did not lead with words. He built the stage, and now the storm played itself. His hammer was still in his hand, its head darkened with blood. Each swing was not rage alone, but justice measured in iron and oak. The carpenter had built hiding places for escape. Now he built graves. Bodies were shoved into the compartments, overseers crammed into the very spaces meant to free the enslaved. Their fists pounded, muffled and frantic, as boards were nailed shut. The wood that had once swallowed chains now swallowed their masters whole. The fire spread uncontrollably. Cotton burned like dry tinder, sparks raining down across the fields. The night air filled with the screams of the oppressors and the chants of the once silenced. Chains were thrown into the flames, shackles twisted in the heat until they dripped molten onto the ground. The rebellion left no corner untouched. Dogs were slain, their howls cut short. The whipping post was torn down, splintered, burned. Even the great house, proud and white, cracked under the heat, its windows shattering outward in bursts of flame. By dawn, the plantation was unrecognizable. Where once stood order enforced by blood, there was now only chaos, smoke, and ruin. Nathaniel stood at the center of it. His back was scorched by firelight, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Around him the survivors gathered, men, women, and children, panting, bloodied, but unbroken. For a moment, silence returned. Not the silence of oppression, but the silence of something finished, something terrible, irreversible. Nathaniel raised his hammer one last time, driving a nail into the door of the tool shed where Crawford's body had been left. The sound echoed across the smoking yard like a tolling bell. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3, each blow sealed more than wood. It sealed a chapter of suffering, of silence, of hidden rebellion finally unleashed. And as the sun broke over the horizon, red as spilled blood, the carpenter's work was complete. What began as silence had ended in screams. But screams fade, fire dies. And when the smoke cleared, only questions remained. Where would they go? What would come of them now that blood had answered blood? Would freedom be theirs? Or would the South, vast and vengeful, hunt them until the last ember of rebellion was stamped out? Nathaniel had no answers. He only knew one truth, carved deeper than any compartment he had ever built. The wood remembers, and the wood would whisper his story long after the flames had cooled. The plantation lay in ruins. Where once whitewashed walls had stood proud against the horizon, now only charred beams clawed upward like the blackened ribs of a corpse. The fields, once endless seas of cotton, smoldered in gray heaps, smoke coiling into the morning sky. The overseers' voices were gone, replaced by the distant caw of crows circling overhead. The rebellion was finished, but freedom had not arrived. Nathaniel stood among the ashes, his hammer still in hand, though its weight seemed heavier now than ever before. Around him, survivors moved in silence. Some wept openly, clutching their children. Others stared blankly into the smoke, as if expecting soldiers to march from it at any moment. The carpenter's compartments had given them shelter, had birthed their uprising from hollow wood. But no hollow could protect them from what would come next. The South was vast, and its appetite for vengeance deeper than any pit Nathaniel could carve. Patrols would hear of this rebellion. Riders would come. Dogs would sniff the trails. Justice, in the eyes of the masters, would mean slaughter. Already, choices divided the group. Some spoke of fleeing northward, toward whispered freedom. Follow the rivers, they said. There are men in Ohio who will hide us. Others insisted on disappearing into the forests, becoming ghosts among the trees. Better to live wild, they said, than to die in the jaws of the hounds. A few, hardened by the night's blood, argued to stay. Let them come, they muttered. We'll build walls higher, we'll burn them again. Nathaniel listened but spoke little. He was not a leader of words. His language had always been wood, nail, and silence. But now, wood was burned, nails bent, silence broken. His craft had reached its end, and yet in the ashes, stories were already being born. The children whispered that the carpenter could build doors that opened nowhere, doors that swallowed men whole. Women told each other that he had struck Crawford down with a single blow, splitting his skull like firewood. Men swore that the compartments Nathaniel made were alive, that the walls themselves had grown hungry and devoured their masters. Legends rose before the blood had dried, but legends cannot shield flesh. That night, the survivors buried their dead quickly without song. They dragged the overseers' corpses into the compartments Nathaniel had once carved and sealed them shut. Wood creaked, nails groaned, and the screams that had once filled those spaces were replaced by silence eternal. The wood remembers, Nathaniel thought, his hand resting on a plank. It keeps secrets, even ugly ones. When the burial was done, they scattered. Small groups slipping into the forests, crossing rivers, vanishing into the wilderness. Each took a fragment of the rebellion with them, carrying Nathaniel's legend like a burning coal in their chest. By dawn, only the carpenter remained. He stood alone in the ruins, the smoke curling around him like a shroud. His hammer hung at his side, its handle stained dark. The plantation was silent but not empty. The wind seemed to whisper through the hollowed beams, low and mournful, like the voices of those who had vanished into his compartments. Some say Nathaniel fled north, carving his way through towns and barns, building safe houses in cities where freedom seekers passed unnoticed. They say he lived to see the Civil War, that he built hideaways for soldiers, that he died an old man with splinters still embedded in his palms. Others whisper darker tales, that he never left Tennessee, that the compartments he built became cursed, traps for any who stumbled into them. Farmers spoke of barns where voices echoed in the walls, of wagons that rattled through empty, of floorboards that creaked like muffled screams. They claimed the carpenter's spirit lingered, hammering still, sealing men into coffins of his own design. Children were warned, never crawl into small spaces, never hide in the walls, lest the carpenter take you. The truth was lost to the fire, but the story remained, stitched into the whispers of cabins and carried down generations like a scar. It was not the tale of a man alone, but of silence breaking, of walls that could no longer contain suffering. Nathaniel's legacy was not freedom, nor victory. It was something more haunting, the reminder that resistance, once born, cannot be contained forever. As the last embers of the plantation cooled, the wind carried with it a single echo, the sound of hammer strikes, faint but steady. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3, each like a heartbeat, each like a warning. What began as silence had ended in screams. And in the ashes, the carpenter's work lived on, waiting for the next hand brave enough to carry the hammer.